I don't get what I want, I get what I need. Every single day I'm heading off to my dream, and I get everything that I damn well please. I don't give a damn if you all listening to me, cause I run it. I'm the only one that really want it, I'm the only one that's really on it. I'm just being honest, I'm just doing everything I promise, cause I want it bad enough that I'ma make it as an artist. And I know I'm not the smartest, and I know I'm not the largest, but I promise you that I'ma be the one that worked the hardest. Cause I promise you that I'm just getting started, and I promise you that my skills are getting sharper. So I'ma get charted, can't be guarded. Nah, I'm the one to get retarded. Get the party started, yeah, get the party started. Yeah, so let me get up on it, yeah. Bitch, you got me fucked up, I don't know what's up. Pour that shit in my cup, we bout to turn up. Crank this shit up so loud, sounds like we're sold out. In front of a whole crowd, we lose control now. Y'all take this shit too personally, everybody got a different version of me. Everybody gotta be learning from me, everybody wanna be working with me. And I feel like there's uncertainty and urgency to find out what you wanna be. But honestly, we change our minds constantly, so stop and breathe and find out who you wanna be. Failure ain't an option, so I'd be cautious. I hope that you're watching. Don't try to stop.
Let's hear a little bit more of that. Let's actually go back a little bit. I really like this song.
Dumb, we would get drunk and then hook up. We were okay, we were alright, staying awake till the sunrise. We were in love, couldn't stop us, like a good drug, never enough. We'd hook up in my car, driving so far, play you guitar, you'd show me your art, let down our guards, think with our hearts, stare at the stars. We were never apart, drinking too young, way too much fun, out in the sun, or rain when it's gone. Took you to prom, dance to our song, dance all night long till the lights come on. Now I remember everything and how careless we could be.
Hey everybody. Okay, so here we are again, yet again. Oh my gosh, it has been a heck of a day for me. Okay, so let's cover a little bit from last night. Let's follow up. We have ourselves the dissenters who are dissenting from the promulgation, from the whatever document. Their dissent, their objections pretty much amount to nothing. Their complaints are trifold. They are complaining that immigration, that somehow the migrant have dignity, somehow violates, amount to nothing. The state's rights to defend themselves or defend their own borders, it doesn't. Their complaints are trifold. Treating people with dignity doesn't take away from that at all. They're claiming that there's some kind of work-based salvation that in the idea that you have somehow the Jesus' commandments to be kind to each other, violate to love your neighbor, to love yourself, to love your enemy, to defend their borders. It doesn't. Obviously, there's no violation of following God's command. It doesn't take away from that at all. Okay. So that's the third one, is that there might be a violation of just war theory. That there's some kind of work-based salvation that in the idea that you have somehow the commandments to be kind to each other, violate to love your neighbor, to love yourself, rights to defend yourself, that kind of borders anymore, because now obviously there's no violation of God's command. It doesn't take away from that at all. Okay. That's the argument. So that's the third one, is that there might be a violation of just war theory. That some kind of work-based salvation that in the idea that you have somehow the commandments to be kind to each other, violate to love your neighbor, to love yourself, rights to defend yourself, that kind of borders anymore, because now there's no violation of God's command. Now we're going to get into some Dan McClellan. So the third one is that there might be a violation of just war theory. Some kind of work-based salvation that the idea that somehow the commandments to love yourself, rights to defend yourself, now we're going to get into some Dan McClellan. So the third one is that there might be a violation whether or not have time to some kind of work-based Yo, what was that? Okay, hold on, we got a problem. I don't know what's going on. Let's see. Yo, 1 2 1 2. Hold on, let's see what's happening. I don't know what's going on. Okay, so we're good there. Let's see. We had like a quadruple, multi-insane echo going on. Let's see if we solve this. Hold on. Let's see. Let's see if we solve this. 1 2 1 2. Hold on. Let's see. Let's see if we solve this. 1 2 1 2. Okay, we're good. Wow, that was weird, spooky. Okay. So when I redo this video, I'll have to make sure to cut that part out. All right, let's get to it.
McClellan, I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the fit for this video is the old school Hulk. Let's take a look at the video.
Here are 5 biblical facts about hell.
All right, let's see it.
Hell is a very real place, whether you believe in it or not.
There are no data in or outside the Bible that's...
So we're starting off with this one because I used to do a lot of videos about hell. And Dan McClellan's pretty much going to say everything that I say, but I have a slightly different take on his perspective, obviously. But he's going to pretty much say everything that I've said in I think the three videos that I did, 2 on my channel and 1 on Garmania's channel.
Support this, the concept of hell is an invention of Greco-Roman period Judaism that was further systematized and standardized between late end.
I still want an explanation, and I think I've got it at one time, but I don't remember it anymore, of how we came to the word hell, because it doesn't make any sense. It's not a good translation for the three words that exist. I'm sorry, Pixie. There was a long intro, and then the mic system just blew up, and it was like triple audio. I think there was like 12. Somehow there was like 12 versions of my stream open. I had to shut it down and open it back up. So, sorry you missed the song. It was good today. It was a good song today. It's NEFFX if you want to go check them out. It's all positive stuff. It's all about reaching your dreams and trying hard and not giving up. It's really good music, and it's copyright free, so it's great for streamers. If you want to find a track of theirs that matches how you feel, it'll be great for your stream. NEFFX. It's NEFFEX.
Antique and medieval Christianity. In the Hebrew Bible, all the dead went to the same place, Sheol. There was no distinction between an afterlife for the righteous and an afterlife
Is he growing a beard? Is that what's happening?
for the wicked. That changed in Greco-Roman period Judaism because Jewish communities were suffering so much under the oppressive rule of different empires, and so authors began to contemplate different afterlives depending on this post-mortem divine judgment that was being borrowed from Greek mythology and
Now, I would push back a little bit further. I would say there's definitely some influence from Babylonian Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism, is that the right word? Yeah.
philosophy, and that gave way to three different concepts of hell in the New Testament that are represented inconsistently, but that are then systematized between, again, late antique and medieval Christianity.
And so even though I take absolutely no pleasure in speaking about topics
Pixie, I miss Scar too.
like this, it does have to be talked about because people perish for lack of knowledge.
No, it does not have to be talked about because it only exists as a threat to motivate desired behavior. It is a...
So I disagree with his take right here. Our understanding of hell, while based on these concepts that you find in the Bible, most Catholics and Orthodox are going to tell you that it's creedal and that it comes from tradition. It's not actually coming out of the Bible word for word. Because word for word, there is no word hell in the Bible. So you have Gehenna, you have Sheol, you have Hades, and he doesn't mention it, but you also have Tartarus. And so I would say that these mentions do give you an idea of some kind of annihilationism, as me and Gur talked about. But the idea of hell as a place of punishment, that's purely church father, that's purely tradition, that's not biblical. So I don't like that Protestants try to place it from the Bible by compiling all these different composite meanings. The tradition says that there's a hell. Just go to tradition and say, look, this is where we get it from. We're taking these ideas and we're saying, how can we make sense of them in a grander theology that we have developed that has informed how we wrote the Bible and how we now interpret the Bible. I think that's a much better approach. Of course, you have to be Catholic, Orthodox, Chalcedonian, Coptic, Ethiopian to buy into that.
A rhetorical whip to crack over the backs of people we want to act in certain ways. And if you are not aware that that is the reason we have the concept of hell that we do today.
And also, I disagree with that crack the whip statement because the default is that you go to hell. Everyone's going to hell. Only the elect, only the few are going to heaven. Heaven is a reward. Heaven is a reward. It's not the default. It's not it's not where everyone's going. Everyone's going to hell. Only the elect are going to heaven.
Yours is the lack of knowledge.
I have a favorite food, so why shouldn't my dogs? Reese loves the multi
Of eternal eternal separation from God. 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 9 says, "They will be punished with everlasting destruction and shut out from the presence of the Lord, from the glory of his might."
So 3 things to note here. The first is that there is not a single occurrence of any of the 3 Greek words that are translated hell in any of the Pauline texts, whether genuine or pseudepigraphical. So those 3 words are Gehenna, Hades, and Tartarus. They don't
I'm sorry, Dan, you did mention Tartarus. I take that back.
occur anywhere in any Pauline text. Second thing, 2 Thessalonians is agreed by many scholars to be a pseudepigraphical text, and I think they're probably right. Wasn't written by Paul, was written sometime after Paul's death, and this would be supported by...
So you got to understand that the ruling from the council that these are inspired isn't taken away if suddenly it's not written by Paul. It's written by an anonymous person, by a slave, by whatever else. And we'll get into that when we get into the Bart Ehrman video, if we get to the Bart Ehrman video. That doesn't take anything away, because the ruling is that it is inspired and it can help give us an idea. Because remember, as a Catholic, as an Orthodox, we view the story of the Bible as the story of the history of the relationship between God and the Israeli people. So therefore, since it's that relationship, as their understanding of God changes, each book changes. While the inspiration holds true, each book is written by an individual person, by an individual mortal, and it has redactors, it has editors, it has compilers, it has people who expand it, people who redact it. So, like, we're not denying any of the biblical development that scholars such as Dan himself would be promoting. We're just saying there's one thing more that's added to it that he doesn't believe in, and that's the Holy Spirit guiding it. So we're adding something to the way that he understands it. We're not taking away from the way a scholar would interpret it. And he can disagree with that all he wants. That's fine. That's his prerogative. But that's what we're doing. And it's important that we acknowledge that, and that we're not hypocrites, and we're not trying to be Protestants and arguing from sola scriptura, because that is not something we believe.
By the fact that this is the most detailed reference of any kind to post-mortem divine punishment. Paul isn't really worried about post-mortem divine punishment. Paul focuses on the post-mortem state of believers. Third thing is that this sounds an awful lot like annihilationism.
Which me and Gur and I think 2 other, I'm not going to use the word that's commonly used, but let's just say neurally spicy people, we went word for word through all the terminology and all the times that that hell is referenced, and through Tartarus, through all of it, and we agree completely with what Dan said. If you go from simply a biblical perspective and you're not looking at tradition, you're not looking at church fathers, you're not looking at rabbinical fathers, you're not looking at the Talmud or anything like that, you get to annihilationism. You don't get to hell. So what's described in the Bible without tradition is annihilationism. You need tradition to get to the idea that it's talking about hell.
Of the 3 main categories of post-mortem divine punishment.
I hope there was sound.
It's not described as hell, but it is described as destruction or ruin, which elsewhere is used to refer to annihilationism. So there may not even be a good case to make that this is a reference to eternal conscious torment in the first place.
Number 2, the Bible says that hell is going to be a lake of fire. Revelations 20 verse 15.
And again, me and the boys, when we were going through this with a fine-tooth comb, nope, it does not. It does not say that. Lake of fire seems to be a completely different thing, and Dan does hit on that perfectly.
15 says, "And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire."
So the concept of post-mortem divine punishment that we find in the book of Revelation is apocalyptic, is bizarre, is quite a departure from what we find in the rest of the New Testament, and probably shouldn't even be a part of the discussion if it were not for the machinations of Athanasius of Alexandria in the late 4th century CE, who wanted it to be included in the canon, even though...
And like I said, in those videos, which is on someone else's channel, when we did this together as a team, 3 different perspectives, me, a atheist, and I believe a New Age Christian. The book of Revelation changes the interpretation of all those verses. Without the book of Revelation, you cannot get to, as Dan will say later, eternal and conscious torment. You can't get there without the book of Revelation. Without the book of Revelation, it is talking about annihilationism, which is interesting because rabbinical Judaism does acknowledge a hell, does acknowledge a purgative type hell, and a Sheol, a place where people just kind of disappear. So it is interesting that hell still develops as an idea in the rabbinical text without the addition of the New Testament and without the revelation of the book of Revelation. So that's interesting.
Christians before him didn't really like it. And what we find there is only one of the three Greek words for hell being used, and that word is Hades or Hades. And oddly enough, in Revelation 20, the verse right before the verse this creator quoted, death and Hades also get thrown into the lake of fire. So the only word.
And when we did that fine combing that took 3 videos, we found that hilarious. We were laughing our butts off about it. And I miss the guys. I miss that. That was a fun night.
That is translated hell in the book of Revelation gets thrown into the lake of fire and is therefore distinguishable from the lake of fire. Now this concept...
I think it was Tux. Who made that observation as we were fine-tooth combing that verse.
Of a lake of fire is borrowing from early Greco-Roman Jewish notions of Gehenna, which itself is probably borrowing from Greek mythology, or at least is merging two different concepts. The concept of Acherusia, a lake in the underworld, and the concept of the Phlegathon, a river of fire that flows down to Tartarus, the third and the least common Greek word that is translated hell in the New Testament. So in order to understand this lake of fire as hell, we have to kind of overrule what the book of Revelation itself is depicting and merge it with the developing systematization that is taking place within early Christianity.
Number 3, it's going to be a place of eternal punishment and torment. Matthew 25 verse 46 says, "And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous will go into eternal life."
So again, the New Testament has 3 different concepts of postmortem divine punishment: annihilationism, temporary conscious torment, followed by annihilationism, and eternal conscious torment.
Pixie, I'm really glad that you're in the room. Just so you know, on Thursdays, I try to do an open room, and I use a different platform, our old favorite platform, for Thursdays. I don't always do it because I don't always have a large audience, but if you're around on Thursday, I'll do an open room, and maybe you can hop on.
And the Gospels is where you're most likely to find this notion of eternal conscious torment. And so Matthew 25 is most likely referring to that. And if you would like a discussion about how these 3 concepts developed and how they're represented in the New Testament, I would highly recommend this book by...
So Resurrection, Hell, and the Afterlife. I honestly would buy this immediately, except for the fact that I have 150 books still to go through on my reading list for this year. Yeah.
By Mark Finney, as well as this article by Heikki Räisänen from this book.
Jesus in Continuum. You know what? Maybe I'd add this one to my list too. I'm not really sure.
Number 4, hell is going to be a bottomless pit, according to Revelations 20 verse 1.
So when me and the guys and the boys were having this argument, and Pixie was there, and so was a few other of our favorites like Brie, we were talking about the abyss, and we were speculating whether or not the abyss could possibly be the actual hell, like the original reference. And we were discussing Purgatorio and the Inferno. And we were discussing it in Latin terms, not in Greek terms, which I'm pretty sure Dan would be very upset about. But we were arguing about the Latin. So I would be interested to rehash that argument and have it in the Greek. If anyone's interested, let me know and we can set that up sometime in the near future. All right.
It says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to a bottomless pit and a great chain."
So the pit, or the abyss, at the beginning of Revelation 20 is described as the location of Satan's imprisonment for 1,000 years prior to their release.
Yeah, that's another thing that people forget, that when they talk about eternal conscious torment, you forget about the whole 1,000 years thing. 1,000 years in peace, then 1,000 years of war, then another, you know what I mean? So like, gets a little technical, and considering that it's a book that's almost entirely spiritual, almost entirely metaphorical, or allegorical, it's really tough to nail that down to something actual.
That location is distinct from the lake of fire, which is discussed later in Revelation chapter 20. Both locations are distinct from Hades, or Hades, which is described in conjunction with death and which is thrown into the lake of fire in Revelation 20, verse 15. So these are three very different concepts, and to describe that.
Again, flashing back to that conversation, we called it the dead death. So it's like a second death, the final death.
Them all as hell is to merge them all together.
Was there sound there? Second death, final death.
How they are represented in the book of Revelation in favor of this conflated, renegotiated concept of hell that we get in late antique and medieval Christianity. And those folks are looking back at the New Testament, and instead of allowing the authors to operate on their own terms, it is just merging it all together into a single concept that can be operationalized and weaponized for the rhetorical needs and interests of the people who are developing this concept.
And number 5, there will be no rest in hell. Revelations 14, verse 9 through 11.
Okay, now I'm just getting the button mixed up. I wonder, as a Protestant, and I know Redeemed Zoomer doesn't have this problem. I'm talking about these kind of Protestants. If you were to point out to them that these are Catholic concepts that they're arguing over, would they get extremely upset? Because there was I was almost going to do a response to Ali Beth Stuckey's guest where they were talking. I might still do it. Probably not tonight, and I might never get around to it. But if I get around to it, I might still do it. Where she was interviewing a guy who she found because he was going against Catholics years ago, and she liked what he was saying. And he was saying that we say who is a saint. We appoint saints to heaven. That's not true. That's completely wrong. We declare who we are sure are saints. But we can never be 100% sure. This is just who we, based on our best guess, are most definitely saints. So there's a lot of other people who are saints. And that's why there's local saints, there's saints of your house, saints of the parish that you're at, saints of the diocese that you're at, saints of your conference, saints of the country that you're in, so on and so forth, saints of each see, and each one's a little different, and then in each rite they're slightly different. But we don't deny that there are saints that are not named in the official Catholic canon. The canonized saints are just ones that we're absolutely sure are saints. We're not putting them in heaven. We can't put anyone in heaven. We're just saying, we're declaring that as far as we can tell, these are the ones that are definitely in there. That doesn't mean that other people aren't in there. So I was going to counter that guy. So I wonder how she would feel if she found out all of these are actually Catholic things she's arguing over, that these were rulings by ecumenical councils that were headed by the Catholic Church. I wonder if that would totally throw off her belief system.
11 says, if anyone worships the beast and its image, receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand, he will also have to drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. The smoke of their torment.
Anybody know what translation she's using?
Will go up forever and ever, and they will have no rest day or night. So I don't know about you guys, but that does not sound fun to me. That does not sound like any place that I want to be, nor do I want any person here on this earth to have to go.
It's also not the kind of place that any loving or merciful God would ever send anyone, because it's...
Okay, I'm going to use the old Catholic line. You guys ready? God's not sending you there. You're choosing to go there by rejecting him. Booyah!
It's just a revenge fantasy that was written in the late 1st century CE by someone who was really upset at the Roman Empire for the suffering and the oppression that it was inflicting upon followers of Jesus. And so they came up with all of this grotesque, horrific, apocalyptic imagery.
I don't think it's grotesque. I don't think it's horrific. And I think it's kind of awesome. And I read that book to myself as a bedtime story all through junior high. A lot of people did. A lot of people think that book's really cool. I get it. You're offended because you have modern sensibilities. Not everybody has your sensibilities. Not everyone's offended.
To fantasize about what was going to happen to them. And within early Christianity, most Christians actually rejected it precisely because it was not the merciful and loving God that they knew from the rest of the New Testament. And again, it was because of the machinations of Athanasius of Alexandria in the late 4th century that it ever had a chance of being included in the canon. So we do not have to take this as anything other than what it is, an apocalypse.
Unless you're a Catholic, and then you have to, or an Orthodox, then you have to accept it as inspired. And if you're a Protestant, I don't know what your reasoning is, because you literally had your top leaders trying to reject this book, and then it got added back in by your community. So I don't know. You guys love the book of Revelation. Don't lie.
Apocalyptic revenge fantasy.
So I pray that whoever this is for, it reaches. Jesus loves you.
Fear-mongering is not an effective way to convince people that Jesus loves you. It's just...
You know, it's not fear-mongering if it's true, though. That's the thing.
Fear-mongering.
Okay, let's rock and roll.
Sum all that up.
Okay. This is where we're going next anyway, so this is good. From Jimmy Akin, we are then going to head into Bart Ehrman. All right, let's enjoy this one. This is going to be on Canaanites, on the slaughter of the Canaanites. The lead up to there's 2 videos before this one that I don't really care about and I wasn't really interested in. I watched them. I don't want to bore you with them. The first one, and there's actually a few other Jimmy Akin videos we're going to do here. I plan on doing at some point the Church Fathers. I'm going to be doing Gods and Generals, and follow that up with Jimmy Akin's commentary on that same situation. I love Jimmy Akin. He's not a great debater, and he's going to be debating James White soon, so that's kind of scary. But anyway, Jimmy Akin here is talking about a video. So we're going to go back to, he's not Godless Skeptic anymore. What's he called now? Anyway. Oh, here we go. We've got a real comment. Let's give a second. First, from Pixie. I am fully convinced and the most disheartening thought is that any of us even get close to right about God if God does indeed exist. No, I mean, I take comfort in, well, that's a lie. I believe that God is real, and I do have a video coming up. I do have 2 videos coming up on my Why Is series. Why I believe the Bible is true, why I believe Christianity is true. My next 2 is Why Is God True, and Why Is the Catholic Church the True Church. Those are my next 2 videos on that. I haven't gotten to them yet. I haven't even gotten an outline on them yet, but those videos are coming up. But I was working on the Tertullian video first. But anyway, back to this. So Jimmy Akin did some commentary on, what's his name? Now I got to look it up. Hot dog it. Anyway, it's about the slaughter of the Canaanites, and William Lane Craig was on one of the old YouTube edgelords who's now like a legitimate apologist and still a skeptic. and a legitimate theologian now, and they were talking about Caanan, the Battle of Caanan, and why. In fact, I got a Sargon of Akkad video on my list of things to watch with you guys, where they're just talking about the justification for the slaughter of the Canaanites. So then Randall Rouser, Jimmy Akin, and then another guy who I can't remember his name, and he's kind of lame, but he's nice. He's one of those nice guys on the internet. And they were commenting on William Lane Craig's explanation. So that's video 1, video 2. And there's an original video even before that where an atheist was saying he would never talk to William Lane Craig because of this. Cut to this video. This is a video. This is the third video in this series. This is the fourth video in the entire conversation. But this is the one that's relevant for us on our channel here. Way too long of an explanation. Let's go.
Hear Jimmy's perspective. You kind of alluded to it in the presentation, but they wanted to really hear you flesh it out. And so,
By liking, commenting, and especially subscribing to the video. And be sure to hit the bell notification when these days I usually...
Intellectual Catholicism. Today, I'm here with the one and only Jimmy Akin to talk about the conquest of Caanan.
So if you guys don't know, this guy's really interesting. He was a Protestant. He discovered the Eucharist. He then did a lot of deep dive into church history. He then tried to become a monk and then tried to become a priest. He was rejected. Went back to being a theologian. He has the Book of Philo. I want that book. I don't have that book. I have these books. These books right here are my book. I have those exact books in my collection. Oh my God. I love it when the apologist has the same books that I have. Yeah, these are all my books. Woo. Okay, except for this. I don't know what this is. All right. Anyway, so he's a real interesting guy. He is very boring on his own. Jimmy Akin can sometimes be a little boring, but together they're a little exciting. So we're going to have a good show.
Jimmy, this is a bit of a heavy topic, but I think the way you approached it on capturing Christianity was brilliant. And I saw a lot of people in the
Capturing Christianity is one of the guys.
comment section saying, we want to hear Jimmy's perspective. You kind of alluded to it in the presentation, but they wanted to really hear you flesh it out. And so I'm more than happy to give you the platform.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be here and, always happy to do whatever I can to help folks.
Well, Jimmy, I guess, is there anything you want to say before we get started?
Nope.
Okay, then let's just first begin with some of the possible approaches or interpretations that one can have regarding the conquest of Caanan. You mentioned these three during your interview on Capturing Christianity.
Yeah, so just, I guess, to kind of set the stage for folks, what we're talking about is certain passages in the Old Testament where that are associated with the entrance of the Israelites into the Promised Land, which was known as Canaan and was already inhabited by people known as Canaanites. And in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books of the Bible, and in particular in Genesis, it talks about how the Canaanites were committing great moral crimes, things like child sacrifice and so forth. And this is fleshed out a little bit.
Okay, the original video that everyone's reacting to is the one on Alex O'Connor's channel. I'll try to put all the videos in the links below if I remember tomorrow morning.
In the other 4 books of the Pentateuch, where it talks about various Canaanite practices, and Moses tells the Israelites on God's behalf that they're to repudiate these practices, they're not to engage in them, and they are abominable. And then in preparing the Israelites to go into Canaan at the end of the Exodus experience in Deuteronomy, God in a few passages uses language that seems to command the extermination of the Canaanites, not simply defeating them militarily, but wiping them out. Not just the adult fighting men, but the women, the children. Just get rid of the Canaanites. And then we have in the follow-on to the Pentateuch, in the book of Joshua, where they actually go into the land, we have a repetition of some of this language. There is a particular custom in the ancient world known in Hebrew as harem, which is often translated into English as the ban. And so if you...
the word is also haram, is what you'll hear Protestants say a lot in American evangelical circles.
Put someone under harem or under the ban, it was a sort of religious act where you would effectively exterminate whatever it is that's under the ban as a kind of act of faith. And so we have some of this language. Sometimes harem, the term, is present, sometimes it's not. But basically, these passages are very disturbing to modern sensibilities. And, we live in a century. Within the last 100 years, there have been multiple cases of genocide attempts to exterminate different people, the most famous being ironically, the attempted extermination of the Jewish people themselves by the Nazis in the 20th century. And as a result, we live in an age where people have a strong emotional reaction against this kind of language. And critics of Christianity, including atheists, will and biblical religion in general, like Richard Dawkins and so forth, they'll point to these passages and say, how can you possibly explain this? Well, that's not a new question, because Christians, from the beginning have been taught, beginning with our Lord, a love your neighbor as yourself ethic. And so it has been a question, what do we make of these passages? That's been a question throughout Christian history. And you find very early Christian authors, like, for example, the early Christian writer Origen, wrestling with these passages and saying, how do we understand them? And basically, classically, there have been two approaches that have been, well, originally, there were sort of two approaches. They've modified somewhat and become three. The original two approaches the first one was to take a literalist approach and say these passages mean exactly what they seem to mean.
So, while you could be thinking a literalist approach is simply a Protestant approach, you're also talking about John Chrysostom. You're talking about several of the church fathers who did take it as history. Interesting when you read the rabbinical commentary on this. It's not completely history, but it's not completely made up. And Jimmy Akin will actually get into that. He doesn't explain the rabbinical side of things, but if you read the rabbinical commentary, it's kind of in line with what Jimmy Akin is saying, even though I don't think he's pulling from these rabbinical sources, not as far as I could tell.
On first reading, and God really did command the Israelites to, in some cases, exterminate the Canaanites to the last person. And for one reason or another, that was okay. And then the question would be, how can you justify that? How can you say why it's okay? And you had thinkers like, for example, Thomas Aquinas, who would say, well, God has the right to determine how much life a person receives, and even though we are not under ordinary circumstances permitted to take innocent human life, God has rights that we don't, and therefore God can intervene to suspend.
And to my ears, Thomas Aquinas sounds a lot like William Lane Craig's argument.
What normally we would be able to do. And he can authorize us. If he tells us to take a life, then it's okay, because we're not doing that on our own authority. We don't have the right to determine that an innocent is to die, but God does. And therefore, if God tells you to take an innocent life, then you could do that. There are more refined ways of saying that. I would say it a bit differently today, but I'm trying to mirror the kind of language that Aquinas would have used. I would put it a little differently myself if I were defending that position. The other early position that you had that was, for example, advocated by Origen, was to essentially spiritualize these passages.
And just to be very clear for those that don't know, I'm really big on Origen. I'm big on John Chrysostom and I'm big on Origen, but I'm big on both of those guys. And I do take a lot of Origen's approach here. I also take a lot of modern scholarship approach here. You'll see me promoting things like the 5th edition of the Ecumenical Oxford Study Bible. You'll see me promoting things like the SBL Study Bible. So I do take the second approach to this, as it is written as propaganda and as a way to control the Israelites of the time of the writing, and not necessarily reflective of the actual story and the date that it's trying to reflect. So it's written later, it's reflecting back, it's kind of doing history, but it's more doing a kind of a moral play for the readers of his time.
And in doing that, advocates of this position would say, well, really what these passages are meant to do is not teach us anything about history, but to teach us a spiritual lesson. So we can kind of set aside what the human author was intending to do and just look at the spiritual lesson that God has for us in these texts.
And that lesson is stay away from idols and don't marry pagans. That's the lesson.
And that would be something like have nothing to do with paganism. Get rid of the paganism, set it aside, do whatever it takes. Kind of like when Jesus says in the Gospels, if your hand offends you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. It's better to enter into heaven maimed or, without a hand or an eye than it is to go to hell. And so Christian scholars down throughout the ages have recognized that as an example of hyperbole, that Jesus doesn't literally mean cut off your hand if you sin with your hand or pluck out your eye if you look too long at an attractive woman. This is hyperbole. It really just means do whatever you have to deal with sin. But the key thing about this spiritualizing interpretation is it essentially ignores the literal interpretation of the text, which is what the human author is trying to do. And for that reason, as later Christian authors like Aquinas retrieved the importance of the literal sense of the text. You need to take account. This doesn't mean reading everything literalistically, but you do need to take serious account of what the human author of the text is trying to communicate to his audience. That's the literal sense of the text, and that's the foundation of any other senses. So you can't just ignore the literal sense of the text and leap to a spiritualized interpretation. You have to take what the human author is trying to do seriously. And so that led to a kind of modification, which is one of the three theories that we have today that are common. The first theory is still the literal one that says these mean what they say and it's okay because God has rights we don't. The second is a modified understanding that says actually if you look at what the human author was doing, he was doing something much more like the spiritual interpretation than was at first obvious. The literal sense of the text really is not kill these Canaanites, but instead the literal sense really is have nothing to do with paganism. And that's just expressed hyperbolically, the way Jesus uses hyperbole when he says cut off your hand or pluck out your eye in order to deal with sin. Jesus doesn't mean that literalistically, but the literal sense of what Jesus says is something like do whatever it takes to deal with sin. And in the same way, the second proposal in its modified form, which is not pure spiritualism anymore because it's trying to incorporate the literal sense of the text, says the literal sense of the text is have nothing to do with paganism. That's really what's being said here. That's what the human author of the text is trying to communicate to his audience.
Jimmy Akin actually has a unique take, and that partially comes from the fact that he has unique dating. I don't know what degrees he has in theology. I don't know if he has a doctorate or not. I don't know any of that kind of stuff on him. I know that he did go to seminary or college. I know that he did become Catholic in that process. But he is one of the most well-versed, well-educated Catholics we have as a celebrity. There's not a Catholic in the world who speaks English, who speaks to an English audience, who is as highly respected for their depth of knowledge as Jimmy Akin. So even if he doesn't have a doctorate, which I think he does, when he speculates on dating, Catholics listen, and they agree or disagree based on the facts that Jimmy Akin presents. So we're not going to Bart Ehrman. We're not going to the University of Rice. We're not going to the Jerusalem University. We're going to Jimmy Akin. He is the person who's given us this information. So that might be shocking to some people because he's not a priest, he's not a bishop, he's not a pope, he's not anything. But he is the person with the depth of knowledge that most Catholics, and I mean priest, I mean Catholic authorities, I mean Sunday school teachers, they go to Jimmy Akin. So just be aware of that. So if it sounds like he's a little arrogant, it's because everybody comes to him for questions. Even the experts go to him in the Catholic world. I'm not talking about, Dan McClellan. I'm saying in the Catholic world. And I would love for Jimmy Akin, not Trent Horn. I would love for Jimmy Akin to debate someone like Dan McClellan. Jimmy Akin has debated Bart Ehrman, but not a debate, more like an open dialogue where they talk about these issues. They talk about dating, and they push back against each other. That would be interesting in a dialogue sense. I do want Trent Horn to bring people onto his show for dialogues that are secular scholars. I do want him to talk to Dan Kip, or to Kip, whatever his name is, to Kip, to Joshua Bowen. I would love for him and Jimmy Akin to have a conversation. That would be really good, because the scholarship is pushing back against Protestantism and evangelical fundamentalism, and that's fine. But the scholarship is also convincing people who don't have a strong grasp of their Catholic faith to turn away. And Catholics are saying, oh, no, we agree with them, but we still believe that it's inspired. And I would love for that conflict to be, and that difference to be elaborated on and expanded upon, so that way we can get rid of some of the nuances and make a stronger division between where the secular scholarship is and where Catholic belief is, because we are dogmatic. And the whole argument that they have is dogma over something, dogma over doctrine or something like that. I would love to see that conversation happen, because that's where the conversation needs to go. Because the internet, science, history is going to wipe out Protestantism eventually. You just can't deny dinosaurs, man. You can't deny evolution. You can't deny coming AI technology. Protestantism is going to die. Like it just doesn't make sense. In a world where modern science is real, either Protestantism becomes wokeism and like just becomes woke progressive Christianity, or Protestantism dies. And if that's the case, then it goes back to the Catholics and the Orthodox, and that's where the conversation needs to turn, where, okay, you get rid of all the false dogma. Now let's put up our dogma against your science facts and see if they match up, see who has the better arguments, has the better proof. I think that's where it needs to go.
Then more recently, now, one of the classic assumptions in Christianity has always been that the texts of the Bible individually are divinely inspired in such a way that you can take a particular text, if you can figure out its meaning, it's going to be guaranteed to be true. But more recently, there have been alternatives proposed that have said, well,
at the 1 hour mark, I'm going to take a 5-minute break, okay? We're not going to be done. I'm just going to take a 5-minute break at the 1 hour mark. That's in about 10 minutes.
Maybe we don't need to be biblical inerrantists, like C.S. Lewis was someone who was not a full biblical inerrantist. Or maybe biblical inerrancy works in a different way than we've historically assumed. And actually, as we can get into this, Pope Benedict actually made comments that seem to move in that direction. But as a result of this reevaluation of the issue of biblical inerrancy, there's been sort of a third position open up, which would be that the Bible contains passages where the human author is expressing a view that is in fact incorrect, that the human author is saying something that is mistaken, and that applies to these passages, that God didn't really command this, and the idea that God did command this stuff is simply mistaken. The human author was a creature of his times. He thought the way ancient Israelites thought, and so he may have believed that God was commanding all this, but that's not actually true. And in order to figure out what the real truth is, we need to incorporate the revelation of Jesus Christ, which has, love God and love your neighbor as the two highest commandments. And so we can only understand these disturbing passages in the Old Testament in the light of Jesus Christ and what he would have us say. And so you need to use Jesus Christ as a kind of corrective to the erroneous viewpoints that some of the Old Testament authors may have had. And so looked at one way, you could say, well, that's a kind of errantism. It doesn't uphold the full inerrancy of Scripture. Looked at another way, and this is more the way Pope Benedict would seem to articulate things, where the inspiration of Scripture lies is not in the individual words of a text. You have to you have to take texts in the overall context of the Bible, including Jesus Christ, to figure out their ultimate.
And me saying exactly what Jimmy Akin said, which for those that don't know, I was quoting a pope, is what got Dan Kipp to say on one of my comments that I don't understand how the Bible works and I can't interpret it. If it was really Kipp and not my lovely B.S. Lewis, who loves to make alt accounts and make them look almost exactly like real people.
Meaning. And so Pope Benedict would say the text is inerrant, but inerrancy doesn't operate on the verbal level. Instead, it operates on the level of the entirety of God's revelation. When you take it as a whole, it is inerrant.
Yeah, just to chime in a little bit, Jimmy, and just for the audience too, when I'm nodding my head, I'm nodding that I'm understanding, not offer, or at least three, right? So the first is, right, you take the literal view that, something like this, or basically what the text says happened from a first glance, or just like a kind of natural reading, I suppose. The second is a kind of, well, obviously, as you said, a spiritual reading where the biblical author wasn't actually intending to assert this as literal historical.
Yeah. Now, I'd push back a little bit there because that's the original. What you had with some early Christian writers like Origen was a pure spiritualizing of the text that ignored the literal sense and just didn't deal with it. The more modern version is not a pure spiritualizing approach. It is not a spiritualizing approach because what it's trying to do is understand what the human author's intent was. And the human author's intent was not to say God literally commanded this. Sure. So I would kind of summarize the three positions this way. The first one would say God really did command Canaanite extermination, and it's okay. The second position would be God didn't literally command Canaanite extermination, and the human author knew that, or at least wasn't claiming that God literally commanded this. And then the third is God did not command it, but the human author did not understand that, but we do understand it now in the light of Christ.
Yeah, and so just to be clear before we continue, at least the first two readings arguably could still, I mean, obviously the first one, but the second one could still be compatible with inerrancy if one holds to inerrancy.
In the classical form.
Sure.
And the third one is compatible with inerrancy if you relocate inspiration to apply to the entirety of God's revelation rather than to the individual words of a passage.
Sure. Yeah, okay. But then of course with that third one you could understand it in a way that allows for errancy.
Yeah, you could have you can have a restricted inerrancy that just says these moral claims in the Old Testament are wrong. But that would be, if you say that, then you are deviating from the more historic Christian understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Pixie. You saved my life. All right. Okay, no, I'm good. Okay, so you have the literal sense, which is historical. This is going to be John Chrysostom, Theodore, Augustine, Luther. You're going to have the spiritual sense, which is allegorical, the moral, analogical. That's Origen. The allegorical sense, which is allegory, analogy, and metaphor. Again, Origen. Typological, which is the moral, ethical. This is Origen and Jerome. And the anagogical, or anagogic, this is Origen and Cassian. I haven't read Cassian. The rest I'm familiar with. I got Cassian in my shelf back there in the other room. I just haven't gotten to him yet. Then there are other sources of interpretation, which there's going to be the liturgical, which is an Augustinian method, the mystery, which is a Desert Fathers method that I really like, the typological, which is Peter, Paul, Jesus, Mark, Matthew, John. They use the typological method. It's funny that these methods develop out of the Christian tradition first. and we don't really acknowledge the topological when that's actually what the Bible uses to interpret itself in the New Testament. Then you have theora, which is mystical, meditative, contemplative. This is Gregory of Nyssa. He's unique, and he's really unique to, Gregory of Palmas is really unique to the Orthodox Church. So this is mystery and theora. This is Eastern Orthodox ways of interpreting the Bible. Okay, this is contemplative, mystical, meditative, Eastern mysticism way of interpreting the Bible. This is going to be the closest you're going to get to, I forgot the word. The people who touch snakes and chant and do all that. Okay, that's going to be the closest you get to it, is right here. It's the charismatic, that's going to be theora. And the way that we use this, I just pointed with my hand, the way that we use this is we then put it through this filter. We ask, is it historical? Is it apocalypse? Is it epistle? Is it epic? Is it polemic? Is it gospel? Is it legal? Is it poetry? Is it liturgical? Is it prophecy? Is it wisdom? And then there's subgenres beyond that. So that's how we're doing interpretation of the Bible. So just to kind of make that very clear, so you don't think that Jimmy Akin's just making stuff up because maybe you're a Protestant or you're an atheist and you've only heard the Protestant perspective, you've only heard the literal explanation of understanding the Bible. We have 5 main senses, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4 other senses available to us. So that's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There are 9 senses that you can interpret any single passage in the Bible. So Catholics are not doing the sola scriptura thing in any kind of way. All right, continuing on.
Okay, so it almost sounds like you could actually articulate 4, but like it's like the third one can split into 2, right? So there's a lot of, I guess, nuances
or 5 if you want to split the second one into 2.
Right. And then even I know some people who take kind of a skeptical theist approach and they say, I don't know, but I trust God, and so I'll walk with God on this issue. So I mean, there's
I would say that's not really a position. That's not an explanation. That's just that's agnosticism on what these passages mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So then, at least what we're talking about are people who are actually saying something about the text rather than kind of being hands off with it.
Mm-hmm. And again, even the methods that I listed there, I'm getting from a Pope's explanation of how to understand the Bible. So that's where I'm getting that from. I didn't just make that up. I've gotten this through secular texts. Also use similar methods, but they use slightly different words for all of these. That's why you saw multiple words for the same thing. But the words that I'm using for these methods are the ones that a particular Pope used in one of his, I believe it was encyclical, explaining how to read and interpret the Bible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So, Jimmy, before we continue, I just want to ask you too, what do you think about going to the first perspective, William Lane Craig's use of divine command theory here? I know that you had some comments.
I'm going to let them keep talking, but I'm going to get some water.
Yeah. So I had a few thoughts. Now, so just again for context, this came up because Bill Craig did an interview with Alex O'Connor, in which Alex O'Connor asked him about this. Apparently, this goes back to a feud between Richard Dawkins and Bill Craig, where Dawkins has been challenged to debate Craig, and he said he's not interested in doing that. And over time, he's offered different reasons for why he's not interested. And most recently, he's apparently said, well, I would never debate Bill Craig because he's a genocide defender, and that's just off the table for me. And that's a BS excuse. He's making excuses there, for reasons we don't have to take time to go into right now. But that's a nonsense excuse. That's not the real reason he doesn't want to debate Bill Craig. However, then Alex O'Connor, because Dawkins had said this on O'Connor's show, O'Connor then invited Bill Craig on to respond, and they talked about this. And in this, Bill Craig essentially defended the first of the 3 positions. And in terms of how he did in that, I think he could have done it better. He, in a couple of respects. One respect was the way he phrased things in terms of God's rights. Now, actually here, he's following the way...
And I want to be very clear here. I don't agree with William Lane Craig's doe in the headlights, let's just let the atheist hit me with a truck approach. Even if Liam Craig's argument is correct, I didn't enjoy that, which is why I didn't make a video on it. I watched the whole thing, but I was like, okay, well, I mean, this just opens up every single objection you can imagine. So I wasn't interested in playing that game because I've been on the internet for over 7 years. I know exactly how that game works, and I wasn't interested in doing that. That's why I'm enjoying the fact that Jimmy Akin's coming back in and sweeping it up. I mean, he kind of already swept up the mess in the previous video, but now he's expanding in a way that is defensible.
Christians have traditionally expressed this, including people like Aquinas. They'll talk about God as a king, and he's got these rights, and so if he says it's okay to do, then it's okay to do. I have found that modern people respond to a different language. It's not factually different, but it helps them get over the conceptual hurdle if you say it like this. All life is a gift from God. So instead of talking about God's right to take a life, I'm putting the emphasis elsewhere and noting it's all a gift. He didn't have to create us. He didn't have to give us life. All life is a gift. And therefore, it's up to God as the giver of that gift to determine how much.
And again, that's how I view salvation. Salvation is a gift. So the majority of people, the default is you're going to hell. If you get to go to heaven, that's the gift. So, yay.
Physical life a person is going to receive. Now, in fact, he's given all of us everlasting life. So he's given all of us, and in fact, given the fact we're going to be resurrected, there's an infinite amount of physical life for us.
Good evening to you.
The future, but it's up to him to determine how much of our initial physical life, how long that lasts. We don't have a right to any particular amount. And so it's up to him to determine how long our initial physical lives are, how much of the gift of physical life he gives us at this phase of our existence. And he can therefore determine the circumstances in which it is, in which one expires. And if he chooses to authorize the Israelites to end the lives of various people, this is just the mechanism by which he is determining the end of how much of this gift of life they are receiving. And I find that explaining it that way helps various individuals get over the hump of this conceptually, because they're not thinking of it in terms of God as a human.
When Jimmy Akin starts getting into the dating of the text, that's when we're going to jump off and go into Bart Ehrman, okay? But we're going to get up to the dating of the text.
King or dictator who is issuing orders so much as they're recognizing, oh, wait, actually everything I've got is a gift from God. And it's easier to understand, well, of course, how big the gift is that's up to God. I don't have a right to a bigger gift than what I receive. And so I find that helps, that way of framing the issue can help modern people. So I think Bill Craig, even though he's following an established tradition in terms of talking about God having the right to do these things, I think the gift language is actually more helpful for moderns when articulating the first position. The second thing that I would say about how he did, he confessed himself to be a divine command theorist, believing that the way he articulated, he said, morality is grounded in God's nature, and then it's communicated to us through divine commands that do have to be consistent with God's nature. But he still seemed to leave a lot of freedom for God. Now, I would agree that morality is rooted in God's nature. God is love, and love is the essence of morality. And there are things that we are morally obligated to do that flow from divine commands rather than just nature, whether divine or human. For example, getting baptized. God, that was a choice. He could have had us, redeemed in some other way under ordinary circumstances than by getting baptized. But he chose baptism. And so that's the way in which we are incorporated into the love of God. So I think there are some examples where you can only appeal to a divine command. You can't appeal to divine nature or human nature as this requires baptism, because God could have done it another way. But Craig seemed to have a much more expansive understanding of what God could do, as if his own nature as if most moral commands didn't flow from a combination of divine and human nature, and God could just command anything. And I think that's mistaken. I think that most moral commands are rooted in the love ethic that is in divine nature, but they're also rooted in human nature in terms of how do humans interact with love and express love. And that's something that varies from between different species. If you're a human, well, okay, given the facts of human.
So I don't know if we're going to cover this in this watch along, but Jimmy Akin does go into animal rights and how we must respect animals, and how the cruelty that we give to animals is not justified, which was very interesting. I'm not sure if he talks about animal souls in this one. I know that he does in other videos. But Jimmy Akin has a very expansive theology and Christology that is very interesting.
Biology, we bear these offspring that have ginormous heads that have to fit through a woman's pelvis, and that means human offspring are born incredibly weak and defenseless compared to those of other creatures. They're much more immature. If you look at a deer and a deer gives birth, if you watch nature documentaries, you'll see the young deer, the fawn, within an hour or so, it's up and running around. Well, it takes human babies a couple of years to get to the point they can to mature, need to stay together for decades. We're not like fish where, the female lays the eggs and the male fertilizes them, and then they out of human nature as a way to express love for each other and for the children and for, in a broader sense, for society. So I think that most moral commandments are in this category. They aren't just divine fiats like baptism.
I do think there's something there that can be explored, which is the different ways of expressing love with different animals, like the way that a cat will express love to its kittens, but not to when they get older, the way that dolphins might express love to each other. So I do think expressions of love or compassion or even passion change between species, and there's a really good question of the way that we interpret God's love, or God being love, versus the way that we understand love as a human being, whether or not they are compatible, whether or not that is the same type of love that we're talking about, or if divine love is something completely different. I think that would be a really interesting place to explore. I don't know if anyone else would care, but it'd be something I'd be interested in.
Instead, they are something that human nature determines how we are meant to express our love, which is rooted in divine nature. And I don't think that Craig came across with that kind of an understanding. He seemed to think God could command almost anything, and somehow it would still be reconcilable with the idea that God is loving. And I thought that there were legitimate grounds for criticism of what Craig said there.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, Jimmy. And also, how's my volume? Is it okay?
It's a little loud, but it's certainly...
His question on, does God command something because it's good, or is it simply good because God commands it? And the question here is there like an independent standard from God by which he's trying to abide? Whereas classically, you want to say that it is precisely God himself who is the good. And so, the commands that flow out from him aren't, let's say, arbitrary, they're from his nature. But there's always been this question that people have raised, like, okay, let's say you solve the youth by saying that God will command things that are in accordance with his nature because he is goodness.
Issue.
Yeah, well, I was basically talking about the Euthyphro dilemma, and I know that when Craig has said that one of the ways he deals with the problem is by saying that God's nature is the good, what ends up happening is some people will say, okay, then let's run with that, and does that mean God, isn't there this problem of, let's say, arbitrariness, where God could maybe just command anything, but because his nature is good, it's okay. So, think of any, let's say, morally, apparently absurd scenario, but because you've already said God's good, that kind of gives him, I don't know, the trump card for anything at that point. And then there's this question, and then what's the meaning of goodness? Or like, is how can we really know then? Is it just, does good become just anything God will? So anyway, I mention all of this because it sounds like to me that, the way that Craig deals with the problem of the Euthyphro dilemma, perhaps it works in that particular case for human morality. But then the question then becomes on divine morality, what, I mean, you can call it like perfect being ethics. What is I think you mentioned this in the interview, what is the divine natural law? Can we say things about the divine nature where God would not command, for example, that I can go and torture children for fun? because he's issued a divine command, could I actually say, oh, actually, this isn't a divine command, or I can tell based on the nature of the command that this isn't the source, that God isn't the source of the command. I mean, it seems like you'd want to be able to say those kinds of checks and balances.
Yeah, and this is something I pointed out I believe, on Capturing Christianity, is, Abraham, when dealing with the Sodom and Gomorrah issue, Abraham turns to God and is hoping to negotiate him down from, I'm just going to wipe out these cities, to, well, if I can find a certain number of righteous people there, then I'll tolerate the wicked for the sake of the righteous. And Abraham, in pressing this point home in Genesis, he acknowledges God is the judge of the earth, and he says, will not the judge of the earth do right? You don't destroy the righteous with the wicked. And so I think that it is possible to look at various moral intuitions that we have and say, yeah, God couldn't command that. Just like Abraham correctly understood, God could not simply destroy all the righteous with the wicked. And so I think that although we have to be very careful and we have to think in a sophisticated way about exactly what is the nature of the moral act that's being proposed in a given circumstance, I think it is possible to look at least certain basic core intuitions and exclude them from things that God could actually command.
Yeah, and I'll just say very quick before we move on to the next question. This was actually something that I wanted to do originally in my undergrad, look into a divine theory of ethics, and see like what are certain things that we would know based on the fact that God is the good itself, or being itself, or ipsum esse subsistens. What are some things that we can say would be impossible for him to command given his nature? So
I'm not being quiet. Just to be quiet, I've heard this. I watched this whole video already once before. There's just not a lot for me to add here. They're asking the right questions, and they are at least speculating what I think is in the right direction. If anyone in the chat has an objection, that would be great, so that way I can have something to respond to, because all I'm going to do here is nod along as they speak, because they're both speaking my language. They're both saying things that I agree with. So any objection is welcome.
I think that the other approach of just saying he could just command anything willy-nilly.
Tell me I had sound on.
That is kind of an extreme from what I can tell. I think we want to say something maybe closer to the middle, or somewhere in between, right?
Yeah. Now, in trying to steelman Craig's position, I think that Craig would agree that God can't just command anything, because he acknowledges that God's own nature is the standard ultimately. And so I think Craig would agree that God can't just command anything. But what I would say is I don't know that he has a coherent account of exactly what God could and could not command. But then I haven't fully fleshed that out either. So I could be open to the same charge. But my sense is that Craig is much more flexible about what he thinks God could command compared to what most people would think God could command.
I was kind of going to say that because his good, because he's one.
How this is upholding the good in these situations. And there are little snatches of this in his interview, but he could say, well, look, the Canaanites were engaged in horrible, evil practices, and the Canaanites who were old enough to be responsible for these actions were ending them. That promoted the good, because it ended these practices, or would have ended these practices if the Israelites had carried these instructions out thoroughly in the land.
I can't do the thing I could do with my nose. It took me a long time to learn how to do it, and I can't do it anymore. So Finster Jr. has come into the chat to say that he objects to Catholicism. Well, Finn, I would like to donate money for you to be a Catholic for a day. If we can start a fundraiser, and we can get a whole bunch of people to do it, and they can give you money to go to church every single day until you eventually become Catholic. How's that sound? On your own. And then you'll start paying people to come to church.
On the other hand, even and this is something he actually did say, or pretty close to what he did say.
For those that don't get the joke, me and B.S. Lewis have known each other for a very long time online. When I'm saying jokes to him like that, I don't have any actual hostile intent to him. Just FYI. Oh, you made me look. You made me look.
Those Canaanites who were young enough that they were not responsible for the practices of their culture, they got good too, because they got taken out of that horrible, evil environment that would have corrupted them when they grew up, and they got to go to heaven on Craig's view. And the Israelites, they also were the good was promoted for them, because if they had carried, or would have been promoted for them, because if they carried out these commands, then they wouldn't have been tempted to imitate Canaanite pagan practices later, and their history would have been different. They wouldn't have had things like the Babylonian exile, for example. And so really, on Craig's view, under this first option, this was an attempt to promote the good, both for the Canaanites and for the Israelites.
Okay, Jimmy, I want to get now to one last question, and then we'll get into your perspective. Mm-hmm. So I know that one popular alternative to the literal interpretation, or at least, well, the people of this camp would consider themselves to be also within the literal vein of the scriptures. Mm-hmm. But some people think...
I think after this point, it's going to be a good point to take that little 5-minute break after they finish this here, and then we'll come back with Bart Ehrman talking about whether or not slaves wrote the New Testament and what that does for the argument for no slavery in the Bible that Protestants like to make. We'll have fun with that one. It was a really good interview.
That every time it says, for example, utterly destroy them, mm-hmm. or it says that they in fact did kill put everything to the sword, everything that breathed, basically, mm-hmm. every living thing.
B.S. Lewis says, my fifis were hurt. B.S. Lewis, we all know you don't have feelings. Don't pretend. Don't pretend.
And then you later see in the text, okay, they're alive, or there's some Canaanites still around. Some people will then say, oh, well, then we need to interpret this kind of language of massacre, utter massacre, indiscriminate massacre, as hyperbolic. Do you think that's a possible interpretation, or what are your thoughts on maybe problems with that view?
Oh, no, it's clear when you read ancient Near Eastern literature, not just in Israel, but outside of Israel, that they used hyperbole in talking about battles. And they would say, like, go exterminate them to the last man. And that was hyperbole. Or looking back on a battle, we exterminate.
That's something I really don't understand when I'm watching Myth Vision. And I avoided watching Myth Vision for a very long time, because every time I would watch it, they would say things that just didn't sit right with me, critical thinking-wise. And this is one of them. This is one of the things that took me a long time. It was actually seeing Joshua Bowen on there that made me willing to actually watch a whole episode of Myth Vision for the first time. And then from there, I've subscribed to their channel. But I've read enough ancient literature, not just what's behind me, but there's like a whole shelf over here. And I don't get how, especially with Dr. Bowen, he reads ancient literature. He's read the hyperbole and the propaganda from other nations. I've read Egyptian propaganda, translated, of course, because I don't read original languages. But I've read propaganda from other cultures before, and it matches right in line in the same time period, roughly, with what the Jewish writers are doing with the Battle of Caanan. And considering that this is written so far later from the events, that it makes perfect sense that you would have this kind of hyperbole and you would use it as propaganda for your current situation, for your current struggles. When you're talking about a previous battle in the past that's barely remembered and they're not really sure what really happened. So I don't understand how these particular group of dark magisterium scholars don't accept the hyperbole part of the argument, because it is hyperbole. It didn't happen. The Bible itself is very clear that it didn't happen. So if it didn't happen, why are we arguing about it happening? That's what I don't get. I'm not saying that there wasn't a war. I'm not saying that people weren't killed. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the actual wiping out of the Canaanites never happened. So why are we using propaganda as a talking point? Yeah, there's propaganda in the Egyptian steles. Like, there's propaganda about who won. There's some battles where every side says they won and destroyed the other side, where it's clearly not true. You get you have sides retreating. We're winning, but we're moving backwards. Like it's very clear propaganda. So I don't understand what they are objecting to in that situation. And JP says, sorry about that, JP. I wanted to finish my point. JP says hyperbole is used in the New Testament a lot as well. Jesus uses hyperbole, and I actually had an argument with a literalist about whether or not Jesus has a sense of humor and whether or not God has a sense of humor, because there is a comedy. I think Esther's a comedy in the Bible. And Jesus seems to have a pretty good sense of humor in the New Testament in his parables, a good sense of irony. So I said God was capable of telling a joke, and or Jesus anyway is capable of telling a joke, and the person I was talking to got offended, got legitimately angry, and called other people in who are Protestants in similar veins of him, and we were just arguing with each other. And I was the only one who said God could tell a joke, and I was just like, "Come on, guys, God can tell a joke. There's comedy in the Bible, like there's humor in there." No one agreed with me in the particular circle that I was in at that time.
Terminated them to the last man, and that was hyperbole. You see this, for example, in Egyptian literature, and it's not confined to Egyptian literature, but you see it in Egyptian literature, for example, in an artifact known as the Merneptah stela. Merneptah was one of the pharaohs after Ramesses the Great, shortly after Ramesses the Great, and he did battle. He invaded the Levant, which is the area connecting Africa to Europe. It's where Israel is, and he invaded that area and kicked butt, which was actually one of Pharaoh's jobs. What pharaohs would do is they would, rather than build stuff at home in Egypt, they would go conquer somebody and take all their stuff. That was you're expected to do that.
I'm going to feed my little troll. B.S. Lewis says that's like every debate I've ever seen. Both sides always destroy the other. Speaking of debates, does anybody know if the Candace Owens Ben Shapiro debate is actually going to happen? Because I want to cover that on this channel.
If you were Pharaoh, they were kind of like the Goa'uld. They didn't make stuff themselves all the time. They would just acquire it from others. And
if you didn't catch that, that was a Stargate reference, Stargate SG-1 reference.
So Merneptah has, been being a good pharaoh. He's attacked a foreign land to get their stuff, and he puts up a monument, which pharaohs do, to commemorate how great he is. And he names the different people that he's conquered on this military expedition, the people he's fought battles with and beaten. And he uses hyperbolic language when he gets down to Israel. And this is like the actual first mention of Israel in the archaeological record. When Merneptah gets down to Israel, he says, "Israel's seed is not." Well, that would mean you killed all the Israelites, including their children. But that clearly didn't happen. He didn't exterminate Israel, but he's using exterminatory language about Israel. And we see the same thing in Scripture, where we have exterminatory language used in some passages. But then it turns out, well, no, there's still Canaanites or different subgroups of Canaanites that we've been told were the objects of being placed under the ban, like the Amalekites. And then it turns out, oops, there's still some Amalekites later. So we obviously have some typical ancient Near Eastern hyperbole at work here in the text.
Right. I suppose that, at least personally for me, just to express some of my opinion, whenever you have hyperbole, it's typically because there's a truth that's being stretched, right? So, for example, like if you say...
I would say a truth being emphasized.
Okay, emphasized. But for example, if you say like, the Chiefs totally slaughtered, I forget what the other team was actually this year's Super Bowl. But anyway, the Chiefs totally slaughtered the other team, right? Well,
okay, even if they don't close out their point, once we get to the 1:30 mark, which is about 2 minutes from now, I'm going to take that 5-minute break, stretch my legs, get some water, and then when we get back, we're going to do Bart Ehrman.
Underlying truth is that the Chiefs won.
Yeah.
They had a very resounding victory, although it was actually much closer. But anyway, but the defeat of the other side. Suppose, Jimmy, I think for me at least, the problem is that when the text really does go out of its way to make it look as if women and children were in fact killed, I'm kind of wondering, like, does the text really allow you to be hyperbolic about these things? Like maybe they didn't kill every man, woman, and child, but can't you say some?
Yeah, so I think that so here's where we're kind of bridging into the second of the two major options today, and this is the one that I prefer. This is my preferred. I mean, I'll mention all three of them to people and let them make up their own mind about how they want to take these texts. But this happens to be the one I prefer. And so the way I would articulate it, I would say, okay, the first thing we have to do in figuring out what the human author is trying to do is situate the text in its historical context. Now, texts like the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then Joshua, which was written in the same basic time period as Deuteronomy, because it sinks into the same book, it's got the same outlook and so forth. So they're all basically written within the same time window. We need to figure out when that is. Now, if these were really written by Moses and his immediate successors, then that would tend to favor the literal interpretation that we've already discussed, because these would have been commands that were actually given to the Israelites as they were coming into the Promised Land. But in fact, most scholars have concluded that these, even though they may have elements in them that go back to Moses, they weren't actually written by him. And in fact, they never claim to be written by him. If you read them, there are various. They never say Moses wrote this whole book. It may say Moses said this or Moses wrote that, but it's an individual passage. It's not the whole book. The whole book never claims to be written by Moses, and there are indications that it was written later. One of the most famous is probably Moses' death at the end of Deuteronomy, where it says, he died without.
One of the most pedantic things that we have to do as Catholics in America is we have to explain to the Protestant, the invisible, not actually present potential Protestant in the room or listening to the thing. So we sound like idiots. We have to cover that, hey, Moses didn't write this, as if we agreed with you that Moses wrote it. It's very troublesome, and it makes us sound like idiots that we have to say stuff. Hey, by the way, rain comes from the clouds. By the way, fire's hot, before we get into the conversation, because of the presuppositions that Protestants come into the room with. So because there's a potential Protestant or a potential ex-Protestant listening to us, we have to say this really stupid statement that you wouldn't say to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. And I do think that hurts the argument. Because we have to overcorrect before we can even get into the conversation. That's what Jimmy Akin is doing here. He has to be like, okay, yeah, Moses, yeah, I get it. Everyone says that he wrote it, but he didn't write it because of this. And it's like everybody else who's doing this work already knows that Moses couldn't have written the stuff the stuff that takes place after he died, when he was already dead. But we have to explain this to people, and it's slightly pathetic. All right, we are going to take a short break. When we get back, it is Bart Ehrman time. Bart Ehrman party. All right, here we go, and I will be back. Love you all. Please be back when I get back. Please be here when I get back. Bye.
Yeah, I don't believe in destiny, I just do what's best for me. Don't listen to my enemies, they're just full of jealousy. Yeah, this legacy, you gon' see what's left of me. You gon' see success in me, you ain't seen the rest of me. I just wanna be the best at what I know, better than the rest, just watch me grow. Put me to the test and watch me go. This is my quest, I'ma make it known. They call me obsessive, oh I know. Call me selective with my notes, call me aggressive with my flow. Call me offensive even though Joe, I ain't gonna lie, life's tough. Try to get by, life's rough. Try to do it right, it's not enough. Even though you try, you still mess up. But I'm still gonna fight for what I love, still gonna die for what I love. Still gonna try, I won't give up. Still gonna fight until I've won. They say I'm way too obsessed and I've got nothing left, and I'm not quite there yet, but those words they'll regret. Cause I've got something left and I'm not giving in. I will not let them win, I won't stop till the end, no. Studied them religiously so I don't repeat history. And people won't admit to me they don't want a victory bad enough to get a C. They'd rather just go leave it be. And oh, this journey I've been on since 13, working hard and learning, never stopping searching. Yeah, it's burning, all this passion hurts me. I took action working, writing down these words. No, I'm not okay, I just wanna be something. I don't wanna be nothing, living all alone. No, I'm not alright, I'm just barely getting by. But I'll tell you I'm just fine, so you leave me alone. They say I'm way too obsessed and I've got nothing left, and I'm not quite there yet, but those words they'll regret, cause I've got something left and I'm not giving in. I will not let them win, I won't stop till the end, no.
Yo, yo. All right, we're back on. Bart Ehrman time. Okay, here we go. I don't know how much of this we're going to get through, but this was amazing. So we might make this a two-nighter or a three-nighter for the Bart Ehrman portion, and we might go through the whole thing.
By
Nope, music.
Renowned Bible and the. I'd like to welcome you to the special edition of the Misquoting Jesus podcast. This week, I will not be interviewed by a woman academic with a British accent. I'll be interviewing a woman academic with a British accent. And I'm very happy to be doing this interview with Caanan Moss. Those of you who came to our Bible conference this past year, new insights into the New Testament, heard Caanan make a very, very interesting presentation for us on the Gospels. And now we're going to be talking about her book that is just coming out. It'll probably come out by the time we play this. Caanan's book is called God's Ghostwriters, Enslaved Christians Making the Bible.
So I'm definitely going to put that on my list of books to buy. Again, not anytime soon. All right.
So I'm going to begin by just saying, giving you a brief introduction to Caanan, and then we'll get into talking about her book. So Caanan Moss is the Edward Cadbury Professor of Theology at the University of Birmingham in England. She earned her undergraduate degree at Oxford University and did her MA and her PhD at Yale, focusing on the New Testament and early Christian studies. Caanan began her teaching career at the University of Notre Dame before taking her current position at Birmingham in 2017. She's the prize-winning author of 9 books, now 10, I guess, both some of them academic books for scholars and some popular books, trade books for general audiences. These books deal with different aspects of the New Testament and early Christian history. Caanan is one of the real public intellectuals in our field of early Christian studies. She's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, Atlantic Monthly, Politico, CNN, and Slate, and probably other things. She's also a columnist for the Daily Beast, and she works as a papal news contributor for CBS News. So, Caanan, welcome.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's great to be here.
Right. So you have this book. It's a book written for a general audience. So it's a trade book, and it's very wide ranging. So as I said, the title's God's Ghostwriters, Enslaved Christians and the Making of the Bible. The book is bringing together two fields that are normally kept fairly distinct from each other. There are a lot of...
Anybody else ever wonder what exactly he's editing out with those little cuts? Because the cuts don't seem to cut out anything important. I always wonder if it's like a sneeze or a stutter or something like that. Maybe he snorts.
People who have worked on issues dealing with slavery in the ancient world, and a lot of people have dealt with the textual tradition of the New Testament, the reduction of the literature, the copying of the literature, the distribution of the literature, but not too many people have worked on the combination of those two things. And your book is in a sense an attempt to show why these issues overlap so much, because of the issue of people who were enslaved and being involved in the production of the New Testament. But even more than that, I'd say the book also goes into issues of slavery within the New Testament itself, within the life of Jesus, the lives of the authors such as Paul and so forth. So could you just say, I guess that was kind of a bad outside summary of your book. Can you give an inside summary? Like what's going on with this book?
What's going on with the book? Great question. Well, I would say about 5-6 years ago, I needed reading glasses for the first time. These. And, I'd worked on disability before, but this was the first time I was thinking, what would I have done in antiquity? And when I looked into it, the answer was really clear. I would have had someone else do my reading or writing, especially as it gets progressively worse. And I had never really thought about that before. And as I dug into it, I realized just how much literate work, whether that was taking dictation or copying a manuscript or reading something aloud or carrying a letter and delivering it and framing it for an audience, was being done by enslaved and formerly enslaved people.
Oh, I didn't realize I had the speaker on. Okay. So I've mentioned this before in my objection to the objection, my counter objection, I guess, to the objection that the apostles couldn't read. If you can train slaves to read, even adult, older slaves, and you can train them in multiple languages, Greek, Latin, what have you, Hebrew, I don't see why it would be impossible if it's truly a 10-year or even 30-year gap between the death of Jesus and the first writings. That's plenty of time to learn another language, especially if you're on the run, if you're in exile, if you can't be in Jerusalem anymore. And let's say you already have 2 languages under your belt. You already have Aramaic. You already have Hebrew. And you need work, you need to learn, you're traveling with fellow slaves, you're traveling with ex-slaves, you're preaching to slaves and ex-slaves, people who can read and write. Why wouldn't you be able to develop that? That's what I don't understand. I don't understand the objection that it's not possible, because it's totally possible. It's totally probable. And especially if some of the Christians are ex-slaves or freed slaves or freedmen, it would make sense that they would then give that to the disciples. And if we're going from oral tradition, if we're going from the Aramaic to the Greek, then yeah, you'd be the same people who are helping you learn how to read and write. You're teaching the gospel that you yourself are preaching town after town, place after place. So they would write in your name. Why wouldn't they? And if that becomes your school, if that becomes your church, and your church is full of these freed slaves, these escaped convicts, if you will, these people who are on the run, why wouldn't they write all this stuff down if they have that skill? So I don't see how that's an objection to the gospel writing, and I don't see how them being illiterate in Greek is how that prevents the Gospels from being an accurate representation of the oral tradition they themselves were spreading in their travels, in their escape from Jerusalem.
And it seemed to me that this was something we just didn't talk about for a number of reasons, a lot of them sort of theological in our commitment to who the...
And again, the Christians are exiled Jews. They're exiled with the rest of the people who are exiled out of Jerusalem. It's not like there's an exemption. It's not like the Romans are like, well, the Christians aren't really Jewish. They can stay. The Jewish people are expelled. The Christians are going with them. So I don't see how it's an impossibility. And I know that this is going to be a popular level work, not an academic work, but I would love to get a hold of her academic writings on this and read through it.
As Christians were, and the idea that they'd better be volunteers and they better really be Christian. And I realized that there's this whole field of scholarship in classics about the importance of enslaved workers in the writing of texts. And I wanted to bring together this sort of new field of classics with the field that you're very familiar with, the copying of manuscripts and the writing of texts, and the work that had already been done in New Testament studies about slavery. And so I wanted to look at the sort of arc of writing from first inscription to then copying a text and moving it and reading it, and who was doing this work and what did it mean?
Okay, great. So I want to start by talking about slavery itself in the ancient world. Most people naturally assume that it was pretty much what they think of today for the situation in American history. Can you say something about, to begin with, just like some of the things that makes, when we talk about slavery in antiquity, in the Roman Empire especially, we're talking about, what's similar, what's different from what we see today? But not what we see today. Although we can talk about that, but we're not going to. I mean, what we're used to thinking about today.
Yeah, so it's definitely important to talk about. I think people have a very distinct thing in their mind. So Roman slavery is different. It's largely fed by war and conquest. It is not race-based, or at least it's not based on the same kind of categorizations of race.
So we're going to go 15 more minutes. I don't know if I'm going to do the bonus material tonight. The audience, even though I'm very glad you all showed up, we don't really have a large audience today, so I probably won't do the bonus material today. And like I said, we'll go about 15 more minutes, okay?
That we have today. So if you have a big conquest in a particular region, Caesar invades modern-day France, he enslaves 1 million people, then enslaved people from that region, they have a particular look, because genetics is local. And so for Romans, people with wavy red hair, that's a sort of slavish trait. So you might kind of incidentally have kind of a phenotypical contours, we would call them, to how people look. You might have a group of people associated with being enslaved, but it's not race-based. You have enslaved people from all over the Roman Empire. But it's not just through war. There are other ways. If people have a child that they can't raise for whatever reason, they might expose it somewhere where a slave trader would come pick it up. There are also what we might horrifyingly call breeding programs in larger households, where people would take infants who are born to enslaved women and educate them because they were thought to be more controllable. And then there are things like debt slavery. You get into debt, you sell your services for a period of time, and there is piracy and kidnapping. But the major sources are really warfare and those enslaved workers being bred in particular households.
Yeah. Okay. So what about like how slaves are treated and what kind of jobs they're doing in antiquity? Are they comparable to what we think of in the antebellum South, for example?
Yeah. So the comparison game is to my mind, difficult. There is something distinctly horrifying about Atlantic slavery in the antebellum South, in the Caribbean, in Brazil. But that doesn't mean that Roman slavery is good. Sometimes there's actually one classicist who compares Roman slavery to an internship at a finance company, and it's not that. Yeah, okay. Except that at a finance company, they probably can't beat you to death. And so in terms of when you think about Roman slavery, it is possible to be manumitted, that is freed. And many enslaved workers were manumitted, often at a stage in their life where something about themselves was compromised. So often women enslaved people were manumitted after the point at which they were able to bear children. So not so great for them. Mm-hmm. In terms of the roles that they play, they do all kinds of things that we would expect, like agricultural labor. They worked in mines, they worked in ports. There are a lot of public enslaved people who worked as civic slaves, doing everything from cleaning a bathroom to taking notes. And then there are sort of the domestic slaves who might clean, but they also might do what we would consider to be quite elite things, like reading and writing, keeping accounts for their enslavers. There are a lot of children who are in charge of finances for households, which is amazing. When I think about, my 13-year-old, I'm not sure I would leave my finances in his hands, but we have funerary monuments to them. So they do a wide array of things. They are subject to violence, sexual violence, physical violence, psychological violence on a regular basis. And it was sort of a tightrope walk. You weren't just beaten for things you had done wrong. You were beaten sometimes just to make a point or because someone was frustrated. And so there is a lot of violence associated with Roman slavery. And even once you were manumitted, you were still vulnerable. The Roman Senate would occasionally discuss, should we re-enslave ungrateful freedmen? So you were vulnerable throughout your life. It was probably a fear that always stayed with you. Was it as horrifying as slavery in the antebellum South? Absolutely not. There's something very distinctive about that. But it's not good. And when people talk about Roman slavery as somehow magnanimous or kind, they're usually doing that just because they really love the Romans. And they want them to be better than they are.
Yeah, no, that's right. Right. Yeah, that's right. And, it sounds like there's a huge range. I mean, working in the salt mines is very different from being somebody's accountant, right? And life expectancy for some of these people was not good. But okay. So it sounds like there's a lot more range than than we would normally experience, not race-based. Was there any kind of, this is the last thing just on slaves themselves, but was there any kind of moral discourse about it? Like people, today we think, oh my God, how can you possibly even imagine it? And, 300 years ago, 400 years ago here, people didn't think that so much. Some did, many didn't. What about in the Roman world? Were there objections to it, or did people just kind of take it as the way it is?
Yeah, there are huge conversations about this. Most famously, people talk about the Jewish rate of Philo. They talk about the Stoics and their sort of their kind of position on slavery and their feeling that there's legal, literal slavery, and then there's sort of the enslaved.
And with the Stoics, I mean, Epictetus is an ex-slave. So yeah, I mean, the founder of the philosophy is an ex-slave. So, of course, you'd have a negative view of it.
Any of us might experience to our bodily passions. And there are people who think that enslaved people are really people, not just tools or body parts or property. And there are particular philosophical schools that talk about that. At the same time, when you look at their writings in their own personal lives, they're still pretty cruel. And they still use pejorative language of slavish to describe things that they just think are beneath them. So there's a conversation going on that really might seem very modern to us, but there are still all kinds of practices happening in the households of the same people who are advocating for enslaved workers that we would not, agree with.
Yeah, no, that's right. And, I mean, some people get really kind of curious about why the New Testament doesn't condemn slavery. And, even though you have this discourse about slavery and kind of, nobody's out there trying to abolish the thing that we know of, at least. So.
That's right. And Christians won't be trying to abolish it for a very long period of time. They will very quickly start enacting their own rules and legislation around slavery. And sometimes you'll see scholars trying to say, well, post-Constantine, the Theodosian Code, by the time you're in the antiquity, Christians are kinder, Christians are nicer. They're still enslaved. Let's be clear. Yeah. There's no kind of kind form of slavery.
I feel that's an unfair discount of the papal decrees to end slavery. So, I don't know, maybe there's some bias there where they're not including the Catholic decrees on this from a Protestant point of view or ex-Protestant point of view.
Right. Yeah, you're owned. And so, okay, good. Well, let's move on to your book is really talking about a certain kind of activity among those who are enslaved, literary activity, principally, people copying texts or helping to write texts or involved in various kind of literary things, which requires an education. And most people in the ancient world were not educated to read and write, as you point out. And yet you have these slaves who are. Can you just say something about maybe just briefly about literacy in general in the Roman world, but then about this phenomenon of highly educated slaves?
Yeah. So, like everyone, I went into this project thinking, well, only about 5 to 10% of people are literate. And we can debate what literate means, signing your name, writing a treatise. There's a range of literacy. And that would only really be the majority of people who were being educated would have been people from wealthy households. At the same time, and precisely because about 40% of the population wouldn't have been able to do their own reading and writing just on physical grounds. Forget your education or socioeconomic background. They are training enslaved workers to do a lot of book work for them. Writing hurts. If you're copying a text, that is painful. Nobody wants to do that. You will shake out your hands. We have medieval manuscripts full of scribes complaining about how much it hurts to copy a text. And so this is one reason that they educate enslaved workers to do this. They don't want to do it themselves. And one of the things that I was surprised by, I thought, well, okay, Cicero, wealthy Romans, with huge amounts of money, they have a whole fleet of enslaved staff who do this book work for them. Fine, we all agree that. But they're rich, they're not Christians, We're talking about the super elites. But the more I looked into it, the more people from the kind of artisanal classes who themselves couldn't read or write would purchase literate enslaved workers to do the kind of bookkeeping, draw up the contracts, do all kinds of work for them, precisely because they couldn't do it. And of course, if you were very poor, you didn't need to write all the time, but you would need a will. So then you would need to go and have someone to sort of put that together for you if you're in some kind of legal debate. So even though it was the very wealthy who had access to a lot of literate enslaved workers, you see more literate enslaved workers in other parts of the population as well.
I saw Bart Ehrman's face there, and I'm kind of curious what the objection is that he didn't voice, because there was clearly an objection there to regular citizens needing a will. I'm curious what the objection is there. And mind you, she's focusing seemingly more on the Roman side of things, and he's, coming from the Christian proto-Orthodox side of things, and he's looking from the Gospels out, and she seems to be looking from the Roman side into the Gospels. But I really wish he would have voiced whatever his objection was, because I really love this conversation. I love where it goes.
Doing work for them, even if they were just rented.
Okay. So what, were slaves the only ones doing this kind of activity, like writing, or like if you, if you need a copy of a document or something, are slaves, are they the ones, or are there others, or what?
So I would group together, like, firstly, slaves and formerly enslaved people, so freedmen.
Yes.
I would put them all in one category. They're not the only ones, but if you go to...
It is slightly shocking, since she's a non-American, how excited she is about talking about slavery in America. No matter who's talking about slavery, we're always like, it's an interesting... It's interesting. I mean, the triangle trade and the slave trade included Europe, and somehow they don't have the same guilt trip that we do.
A bookshop in Rome, every book dealer we know of is a Roman freedman.
So that's interesting. And I can't help but think about video games here, with Assassin's Creed and a few other video games that take place in the past, that all the bookshop owners, all the stores that we know of, are ex-freedmen or ex-slaves. They're freedmen, they're ex-slaves. These are ex-slaves who are reading, who are literate, who are doing these things. These are slave hobbies, slave things in the Roman culture. That's amazing to me. And I think we miss that.
It doesn't mean they're not other people copying text. We know that that would happen regularly. But if you have a very long text, if you want something that looks sort of professionally copied, that's a profession. You have to be trained to write, a beautiful codex. That's not a thing I could do.
Well, I'm sure you could, but I couldn't.
My handwriting is not as good as yours. I use a computer now.
Exactly.
And I actually won a handwriting prize when I was young, but I use a computer now and my handwriting doesn't look
You
the
won
same.
a handwriting prize. Yeah, of course you did. Yeah, I did not.
I'm from England. We had like needlework and handwriting and no physics.
Yeah, right. But I mean, there must have been there. I mean, so like if I want a really nice copy of a book, there's not, I mean, obviously you don't have your, your Copytron down the street or your FedEx or whatever, you can photocopy it. So somebody's got to copy it. So, but are the people doing that, they're not people like getting paid to do this. They're slaves.
Someone's getting paid, but they aren't getting paid. So they, by and large, it seems to me from the evidence we have, which is limited, you have a freedman bookseller who's probably past the point where they can copy things themselves. They probably have carpal tunnel. It's probably very difficult for them. They would have an enslaved staff working for them, and that staff would be young.
Okay.
They would be children, and that's the evidence. If you want something really beautiful made for you, we don't. If you have something short, like Paul's Ladder to Philemon, that's a different situation.
Okay.
Sort of anyone who is literate could write that out for you. But even copying Romans, that's effort, that's work. And the copyists in particular in this period seem to have been enslaved or formerly enslaved.
Okay, good.
There's a question here about whether only the copyists were slaves and the original recorders may have been freedmen, or if there was some kind of poor attempt by the oral dictators, either the initial readers, which we would assume would be the initial speakers, who would be the assumingly the apostles, or their disciples who would have tried writing it down the first time, or if it was this later group that inherited the oral tradition that would write it down for the first time. And if there are poor attempts at this that just didn't survive, that's a very interesting idea. And I don't know if that flies in the face of Q. That's another thing that we'd have to factor in. But yeah, I thought this is a fascinating conversation. All right, I'm about to jet. If you guys have any last questions or last comments, please put them in the chat right now. We got about 2 minutes before I'm going to call it a night. This was a pleasure. This was a fun stream. I hope to see you all tomorrow. We're going to continue with this video. And thank you all. And good night. You got about a minute left to ask a question if you have anything. And if not, we are good. Okay. I don't know if that's copyrighted, my own humming. All right, later all. Good night.
Yeah, I don't believe in destiny. I just do what's best for me. Don't listen to my enemies, they're just full of jealousy. Yeah, this legacy, you gon' see what's left of me. You gon' see success in me. You ain't seen the rest of me. I just wanna be the best at what I know. Better than the rest, just watch me grow. Put me to the test and watch me go. This is my quest, I'ma make it known. They call me obsessive, oh I know. Call me selective with my notes. Call me aggressive with my flow. Call me offensive even though Joe, I ain't gonna lie, life's tough. Try to get by, life's rough. Try to do it right, it's not enough. Even though you try, you still mess up. But I'm still